What's going on, my friend? It's Danny here from projectmaniverse.com, real world technical project management for beginners. So today I'm going to give you 5 warning signs that your scope management as a project manager is poor. I'm going to explain what scope management is. I'm going to tell you why you should be interested in this and why it's important for you as a project manager. And then we'll go on to the 5 tips. So let's start with scope management. What is it? First of all, we need to start with what is scope. Now, scope is very important for IT projects. It's a fundamental piece of the puzzle. So scope could be described as a description of what the project is delivering. It explains exactly what the project is doing, and you can have high level scope or you can have low level scope, but generally scope is done at a higher level. It doesn't go into all the exact details and requirements, but it does describe everything the project is doing, and everything you do on your project throughout the life cycle of the project can be traced back to that scope. You shouldn't be doing anything on your project that can't be found on that scope document. So the scope document describes what the project is doing. A tool I really like to use is a scope on a page. I like to have a 1-pager that captures all the scope. To give you an example, we're talking about IT projects here. So a very typical IT project is to upgrade some software. So that's your key bit of scope. The overall delivery is to upgrade the software. But there could be some pretty big pieces to doing that. You might have to also upgrade the database. You might have to upgrade some of the servers and the operating system. You might have to manage some upstream and downstream impacts of other systems that interact with the system that you're upgrading. So those kind of key pieces you want to include on your scope on a page, so you can clearly see the scope of the project. And also what the scope does, it defines the boundaries of the project. You can also include on there the key things that are out of scope for your project that you are not on the hook for delivering. It's important to get those things captured. So that's what it does. It describes what the project is doing, and it gives you boundaries around what you're doing. It frames it nicely. And you can have various perspectives on scope. You can just think about the scope of delivery, i.e. what you're actually building. You could also have scope of documentation. What's all the documentation you need to produce on your project? You could think about the scope of the testing. What are all the different tests you need to do? So you can think about it through different lenses, but the scope is generally what your project is doing. And when we say scope, we generally mean what are you actually delivering. That's the key scope, and then you can have your various slants on it after that. Now, scope management is scope management is first of all pulling together all that scope. It's making sure that all the stakeholders on your project are aware of it and they're all agreed and signed up to it. It's also about maintaining that scope. As a project manager, you're kind of like the guardian of that scope to make sure it doesn't change too much, or if it has to change, it's going through the right governance to do that. So scope management is making sure that that scope is locked down throughout the project and you're always maintaining it and everyone's aware of it, and you're constantly communicating that scope so people don't forget what it is. So hopefully you now understand what scope management is at a high level. Why is this important for you as a project manager? I've already said it's a fundamental building block, because obviously without the scope, you don't know what to do on your project. You don't know what you're actually building or what you're designing. So it's a critical piece, but it gives you a scope. Has hidden benefits like the iceberg, where you've got the tip of the iceberg above the water but loads of the iceberg under the water that you don't see. There's benefits underneath there. A good scope can give you focus and clarity on your project. It can give you laser-like focus. You know exactly what you're doing, so it's beneficial to understand that. It can help you manage scope creep as well. You'll hear that phrase a lot in project management, when the work that you are supposed to be doing seems to add up and keep piling up and new requirements are coming in. It prevents that scope creep if you do your scope management well. So it's important that you understand how to do it. So those are a couple of reasons why you should take this seriously and understand what scope is and what scope management is and how to do it. Now, there are some warning signs in terms of when your scope management is not very good, shall we say, if you have poor scope management. And I've seen this time and time again on various projects. So let me go through the warning signs. First of all, if you find as a project manager that you don't have a clear vision for your project, a clear direction and vision, and you're starting to feel anxiety about where you're going, and it's you feel directionless and your team feels a bit directionless, that's probably a good sign that you don't have a very clear scope to strive towards. That's your first warning sign. When you think about your project end state and the final goal of the implementation, you should have a clear vision in your mind about what you're building, even if it's just a picture that's been drawn. You can see that picture clearly, because obviously when you're building IT things, it's all code and in the ether out there, but you can find a way to get a clear vision. But if you don't have that and you're feeling anxiety about where you're going or what the final end vision is, that is a very clear warning sign that you don't have a clear scope and your project scope management is poor. So that's warning sign number one. Number two is if you feel you're not making progress on your project. It's very easy to waste money and waste time on projects when you have all these people aligned. There's always work to be done and people are busy and in meetings and stuff is happening. But if you don't have a sense of you're making progress, that is probably because you don't have a clear end goal vision. You don't have a clear scope, so you can't measure your progress to anything. You can't say, right, we've done 10%, 20% of that build, and clearly get that confidence that you're making progress as you go along, because you can tick off the scope as you go. So that is warning sign number two. Warning sign number three is if you find yourself doing things for other people a lot and you're accepting work in your team for other people, or you're supporting them and helping them, that probably means that you're not very clear on what you should be doing and what your team should be doing. So you're allowing that work to come in just to keep busy and to show that you're doing something, you're doing work. That's a sign that you're not managing your scope correctly. You haven't got it nailed down. You're not very clear on what you should be doing. Because if you're very clear on what you should be doing, you should have a very clear plan about who's delivering it, and there shouldn't be much room or time to do anything else. Okay, so if you're accepting a lot of work or helping other people, that could be a sign that your scope management is not clear. Now, warning sign number four is kind of related to that, and I touched on it earlier. If you find that you keep having to do new stuff on your project, or your scope is building up, or you keep getting new requirements in to build and they're coming left and right at you, and you have to keep doing more work, that is basically scope creep. And that means that you haven't clearly locked down what you should be doing at the start of the project. You haven't set those boundaries clearly, communicated them with everyone, and got them all signed off. Because if you start to do more work, or you start to be asked to do more work, you should be in a position where you can say, that's not in our original scope, we can't do that. If you really have to do it, we have to go through some kind of governance. You have to go through the change request process. The person who wants the work will have to raise a CR. That CR will have to be impact assessed. You have to kind of say, right, if we do this, it's going to cost this much money and take this much time, which we don't have. Where's that money coming from? Where's the resource to do it coming from? So you can push back and be a bit firm with your scope. So if your scope keeps increasing throughout the project, that's probably because you haven't locked it down at the start and your scope management is poor. So that's warning sign number four. Now, the last warning sign is regarding your team. Now, a good successful project should have a good cohesive team that works well together, is motivated and is fired up every day. If you don't have that and your team are lacking motivation and they're despondent and they're not really going on full cylinders, that's probably because they lack direction, they lack clarity of where the project is going, they lack leadership. So you're being as leader, you need to make sure that vision is clear. But if you find your team is despondent and they're not really giving it their 100%, that's probably a sign that they don't have a clear vision, which means that you're not clear on your scope, you haven't communicated it, and that's a sign of poor scope management. So make sure you get that covered. Okay, so those are the 5 warning signs. Let me do a quick recap of the video and then we'll call it a day. So first of all, what is scope management? Let's start with scope. Scope basically describes what the project is doing, and you can have a high level scope, which is what I like to do. Use the scope on a page, which kind of captures those high level elements of what your project is delivering. For example, a database upgrade, a software upgrade, some new interfaces between systems, bit of training maybe. Those high level things, that's what your scope is. It defines what's in the project and what's out of this project, and it sets those boundaries. And you should worry about this, and it's important for you because it's one of the fundamental building blocks of project management. You have to start with the scope. You've got to start there, then you can break that scope down into smaller elements, and then you can plan that into a detailed plan. And now you've got your vision and how you're going to get there. You've got your roadmap and you're ready to go, and your project is likely to be successful. Without a clear scope, everything can start falling apart. So it's really important that you get a good grip on scope and scope management as a project manager. So what are the warning signs that you might not be clear on your scope and your scope management is poor? Number one, if you lack clarity and vision on your project, you can't see the end state. When you think about it, it's a bit fuzzy. That's a warning sign that you don't have a clear scope. So get that sorted. Number two, if you don't feel like you're making progress on your project, it means that you're not clear on what the end state is, and you can't compare your current progress with what the end state is, so you don't feel like you're making progress. That is warning sign number two. Warning sign number three is if you're constantly helping other people or other teams or accepting other work from other people. That means you're probably not very clear on your own scope, because if you have your scope nailed down, you should have a detailed plan for delivering that scope, and your resources should match up to that delivery, and you shouldn't really have any excess resource available to do other work. Okay, so that is warning sign number three. Warning sign number four is if you get the scope creep, where your work keeps piling up and you're doing extra work that wasn't agreed or talked about at the start of the project. It's new stuff. Again, if you haven't locked down your scope and kept it firm and locked down throughout the project, and you keep accepting new scope, that means you're either accepting it without going through the proper governance, or you weren't clear on what the scope was at the start of the project. So that's another warning sign. Last warning sign is if your team is feeling despondent and you're not getting the best out of them, and they seem to lack motivation. That means they lack a vision and an end goal, something to really focus on and get behind. Okay, that's the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and until tomorrow, please take care.